God the Evidence, the Reconciliation of Faith and Reason in a Post-Secular World, abridged, by Patrick Glynn, read by Vincent Bagnall. The Making and Unmaking of an Atheist. This book had its origins in a spiritual awakening, or, to put the situation somewhat less glamorously, after many years of being a philosophical atheist, or agnostic, I finally realized that there was in fact a God, a soul, a survival after death. And this, of course, would not be news to most people. Depending on how you interpret opinion polls, upwards of 70% of Americans seem to share such beliefs. But for me, as I think would be true for many others like me, and possibly even for some of you, it was news. Big news. For despite the fact that the overwhelming majority of Americans are believers, our intellectual culture has been dominated by skepticism. When I did undergraduate and graduate work at Harvard in the 1970s, for example, it was taken for granted that traditional religious beliefs were a thing of the past, invalidated by science, incompatible with a modern outlook. There were believers among the professors, of course, but the culture was agnostic. There was a certain tendency, which I came to share, to view religious belief and practice as manifestations of intellectual inconsistency, emotional weakness, or a lack of cultural sophistication. This is an old complaint among religiously minded people, and I don't wish to add my voice to those of the complainers. I would argue instead, and I try to show this in this book, that the situation is in the process of changing. The day, I believe, is soon coming when skepticism, unbelief, is going to be the minority position, not just among the populace at large, but even among intellectuals. What happened to me, the rediscovery of the spiritual, is happening to others and is on the verge of happening to our culture as a whole. The reason lies in a series of dramatic new developments in science, medicine, and other fields that have radically transformed the old existence of God debate. Essentially, over the past 20 years, a significant body of evidence has emerged, shattering the foundations of the long-dominant modern secular worldview. These new discoveries, it seems to me, add up to a powerful, indeed all but incontestable case for what once was considered a completely debatable matter of faith, the existence of soul, afterlife, and God. I came upon these new discoveries rather late in the game, long after I had decided, on the basis of intensive philosophical study, that there was no God in a personal sense, no afterlife, no soul. I embraced skepticism at an early age when I first learned of Darwin's theory of evolution in, of all places, Catholic grade school. It immediately occurred to me that either Darwin's theory was true, or the creation story in the book of Genesis was true. They could not both be true, and I stood up in class and told the poor nun as much. Thus began a long odyssey away from the devout religious belief and practice that had marked my childhood toward an increasingly secular and rationalistic outlook. I was not alone on this journey. In the 1960s, American culture was entering a secular phase. Vatican Council II, the great leap of the Catholic Church into modernity, had left even devout Catholics with many questions about their faith. The period was rife with experimental notions, and religious intellectuals were increasingly absorbing the secular themes and tendencies of the larger culture. In 1965, theologian Harvey Cox published The Secular City, an enormously influential book that argued that the churches should simply abandon all notions of transcendence and spirit in favor of a new model of positive social change based on secular social science. The following year, Time magazine, surveying the state of contemporary theology, asked on its cover, "Is God dead?" Psyche and Soul, Post-Secularism in Psychology. After Darwin and the random universe, the second great challenge to religious belief in the 20th century came from Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis was a major force for secularization in 20th century societies, inspiring a virtual revolution in manners and morals. It was also an explicitly atheistic, indeed openly anti-religious doctrine. Freud attacked religious belief repeatedly. In The Future of an Illusion, which was written in 1927, he branded faith as a form of mental disorder, a universal obsessional neurosis rooted in infantile and narcissistic patterns of thought, a neurosis that he predicted humanity would outgrow. Not all psychoanalysts were as militantly atheistic as the master. Freud's disciple turned rival Carl Jung was a notable exception in viewing religion as a beneficial psychological force. But Freud's jaded view of religious belief shaped the majority outlook of the mental health profession, especially in the U.S. In 1975, an American Psychiatric Association task force reported that a bare 43% of American psychiatrists believed in God, as compared to roughly 95% of the American population as a whole. The figures for the American Psychological Association were even more striking. A 1972 poll showed that a mere 1.1% of psychologists were believers. Freud was not the only thinker responsible for this state of affairs. Some of the most important non-Freudian psychological theorists were also outspoken atheists. B.F. Skinner, a founder of the behaviorist school, was a militant non-believer. Albert Ellis, the founder of rational emotive therapy, wrote extensively on religion as a cause of disease. In a society rushing headlong toward secularization, psychoanalysis and psychology were among the most important bastions of unbelief. The faith factor. At the root of modern psychology was a Faustian ambition to replace the traditional religious understanding of the soul with a complete new mechanistic, value-free account of mental life based entirely on science. This ambition was announced as long ago as the 17th century by Thomas Hobbes, the first modern thinker to attempt to apply the methods of the new physical sciences to social and mental life. Hobbes' denial of the soul won him wide condemnation as an atheist. Freud's comments on religion and science were merely an audacious restatement of this original modern Enlightenment theme. But as the 20th century winds to a close, the modern secular psychological paradigm is in a state of intellectual collapse. Far from confirming the various modernist theories of mental life, decades of research and clinical practice have in fact demonstrated again and again the impossibility of formulating a coherent view of human life absent the moral and religious horizon. Slowly but surely, modern psychology is belatedly rediscovering the soul. Take the research on religious belief itself. The verdict here is overwhelming. It is difficult to find a more consistent correlative of mental health or a better insurance against self-destructive behaviors than a strong religious belief. A sample of the findings. Suicide. A large-scale 1972 study found that persons who did not attend church were 4 times as likely to commit suicide than were frequent church attenders. A review of 12 studies of the relationship between religious commitment and suicide found a negative correlation in all 12 cases. Lack of church attendance has been found to be the single best predictor of suicide rates, better even than unemployment. Drug abuse. Numerous studies have found an inverse correlation between religious commitment and the abuse of drugs. One survey of nearly 14,000 youths found that substance abuse varied in direct proportion to strength of religious commitment, with the most conservative religious youths abusing the least. The authors concluded that the importance of religion was the single best predictor of substance abuse patterns. Alcohol abuse. Several studies have found that alcohol abuse is highest among those with little or no religious commitment. One study found that nearly 90% of alcoholics had lost interest in religion in youth, while among the non-alcoholic control group, 48% reported an increase in religious commitment in adulthood, and 32% reported no change. Depression and stress. Several studies have found that high levels of religious commitment correlate with lower levels of depression, lower levels of stress, and greater ability to cope with stress. Religious people recover from surgery more quickly than do their atheistic and agnostic counterparts. Divorce. A number of studies have found a strong inverse correlation between church attendance and divorce. Church attendance also correlates strongly with the expressed willingness of a partner to marry the same spouse again, a measure of marital satisfaction. Marital and sexual satisfaction. A 1978 study found that church attendance predicted marital satisfaction better than any other single variable. Couples in long-lasting marriages who were surveyed in another study listed religion as one of the most important prescriptions of a happy marriage. Most strikingly, an analysis of data from a massive survey of Red Book magazine readers in the 1970s found that very religious women report greater happiness and satisfaction with marital sex than either moderately religious or non-religious women. So religious people even seem to enjoy better marital sex. Overall happiness and psychological well-being. Strong religious believers consistently report greater overall happiness and satisfaction with life. In one Gallup survey, respondents with a strong religious commitment who agreed that my religious faith is the most important influence in my life were twice as likely as those with minimal spiritual commitment to describe themselves as very happy. To be sure, there are exceptions to every rule, and one can no doubt find cases where extreme religious views are bound up in psychopathologies. But the statistics make a powerful statement about the typical human condition. In short, if religion is an obsessional neurosis, we should all hope to be neurotic in this way. Value-free living. Interestingly, the data correlating religious commitment with mental well-being is mirrored by growing evidence of a powerful relationship between licentious conduct and unhappiness, or what we might call in plainer language, sin and misery. One of the most striking examples comes from the New Harvard Guide to Psychiatry, hardly a religious text, published in 1988. In a chapter on the adolescent, the editor, a Harvard Medical School psychiatry professor, detailed some of the pernicious psychological and health consequences of the sexual revolution and youth promiscuity of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Many who have worked closely with adolescents over the past decade have realized that the new sexual freedom has by no means led to greater pleasures, freedom, and openness, more meaningful relationship between the sexes, or exhilarating relief from stifling inhibitions. Clinical experience has shown that the new permissiveness has often led to empty relationships, feelings of self-contempt and worthlessness, an epidemic of venereal disease, and a rapid increase in unwanted pregnancies. Clinicians working with college students began commenting on these effects as early as 20 years ago. They noted that students caught up in this new sexual freedom found it unsatisfying and meaningless. A more recent study of normal college students, those not under the care of a psychiatrist, found that although their sexual behavior by and large appeared to be a desperate attempt to overcome a profound sense of loneliness, they described their sexual relationships as less than satisfactory and as providing little of the emotional closeness they desired. They described pervasive feelings of guilt and haunting concerns that they were using others and being used as sexual objects. The author went on to quote Freud on the inadvisability of unrestricted sexual freedom. Now, of course, while Freud was on record opposing promiscuity, his early theory of repressed sexual urges, or the dammed-up libido, made a major contribution to the transformation in Western sexual mores. The author then commented on the trend toward religious revival among youth. The disillusionment of late adolescents with this sphere of their lives, as well as with drugs, has contributed to the recent religious preoccupation among youth, especially the trend toward traditional religious faith. Although the basic Judeo-Christian morality conflicts strongly with their past behavior and current mores, they find the clear-cut boundaries it imposes less confusing than no boundaries at all, and more helpful in relating to members of the opposite sex as persons rather than sexual objects. Some of the clearest evidence that has been accumulated along these lines comes in the field of divorce. Many, though not all, religions place prohibitions on divorce. Jesus in the New Testament texts is particularly emphatic on this theme. Such prohibitions turn out to have not merely a spiritual but also a strong public health justification. Basically, the research shows that divorced and separated people are more likely than the general population to suffer serious physical and mental health problems and are at significantly higher risk for alcohol abuse, premature death, and suicide. One could contemplate the posting of one of those famous Surgeon General's warnings over the doors of divorce courts. This is to say nothing of the harmful consequences for children, extending from poorer school performance to higher rates of juvenile delinquency and teen suicide among youths from broken homes, all of which have been amply documented. In short, the burden of both clinical experience and the research data suggests that among the most important determinants of human happiness and psychological well-being are our spiritual beliefs and moral choices, at least in the aggregate. People of strong religious faith and attempt to live by its principles will tend to be much happier and lead far more productive lives than people who don't. Now, this is not to deny the importance of other factors in making for mental stability, or to argue that psychotherapy cannot be of great use to individuals in healing the wounds of their past, but it does suggest the inutility of approaches to therapy that ignore the spiritual dimension of human existence, or that have nothing to say about right or wrong. It is precisely the inability to speak to the last issue that has helped spell the catastrophic decline in the reputation of traditional psychoanalysis in recent years. The problem was dramatically exposed during the famous Woody Allen-Mia Farrow child custody case in the early 1990s. Allen had spent years in psychoanalysis, and a number of psychiatrists testified in the case. Psychiatrist William Doherty, who has written on the issue of psychiatry and moral responsibility, provides an excellent commentary on the issue. A prominent issue was Allen's fitness as a parent, given his secret affair with Farrow's 19-year-old daughter. As in most child custody disputes, no one came out unscathed, least of all the therapists who testified as expert witnesses. When questioned about whether they thought it was right for Allen to have a secret affair with his lover's daughter, the therapists all demurred from making evaluative judgments. They used language reminiscent of the Watergate hearings. Mr. Allen may have made an error in judgment, a mistake given the circumstances. And my personal favorite, the situation was a reflection of the postmodern family. Finally, in a moment of exasperation, after trying unsuccessfully to get any expert witness to break out of morally neutral therapeutic discourse, the judge angrily cut off one of these words. I find it extraordinary, the words that therapists use who come here, and they can say bad judgment or lack of judgment. But isn't there something stronger? You went through the postmodern structure of the family and types of relationships. We're not at the point of sleeping with our children's sisters. What does it mean? The Allen case vividly illustrated the hazards of value-free living and of a substitute religion that sanctions such a lifestyle. Spiritual growth. Far from replacing religion, modern psychology at the close of the 20th century seems to be reacquainting itself with religion, reimporting into psychological theory many of the religious ideas and moral categories that were once banished as vestiges of an obsolete, unscientific worldview. Of course, there always was an alternative strand of thinking among psychological theorists that was far less hostile to religion than Freud was. Jung's differences with his former mentor on this issue are well known. Among all my patients in the second half of my life, Jung observed in 1932, there has not been one whose problem in the last resort was not that of finding a religious outlook on life. It is safe to say that every one of them fell ill because he had lost that which the living religions of every age have given their followers, and none of them has been really healed who did not regain his religious outlook. Jung played an indirect role in the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous, in which the acknowledgement of a higher power forms a central plank of this most famously successful treatment for alcoholism. Erich Fromm was an agnostic who took a much less critical view of religion and who absorbed important religious concepts into his theory of personality, notably the New Testament idea of agape, or unconditional love. Viktor Frankl, a survivor of Auschwitz, formulated a brand of existential therapy that incorporated spiritual conceptions into therapy in a unique fashion. His Man's Search for Meaning was one of the century's more popular books. During the 1970s, Abraham Maslow pioneered the psychological investigation of mystical or peak experiences, treating them not, as Freud would have done, as instances of primary narcissism, but rather as manifestations of a higher form of consciousness. An important sign of change came with the publication of M. Scott Peck's The Road Less Traveled, A New Psychology of Love, Traditional Values, and Spiritual Growth, in 1978. And Peck openly criticized his psychiatric colleagues for slighting religion and offered his own synthesis of religion and psychoanalysis, a new psychological approach that mixed talk of repression and cathexis, with a stress on such traditional values as discipline, self-sacrifice, love, even grace. Evidently, Peck's book struck a chord. It remained on the New York Times bestseller list for more than 10 years. A second bestseller followed, People of the Lie, in which Peck made the case for a recovery of the category of evil in psychoanalytic discourse. As the best-selling psychological text of the last quarter of the 20th century, The Road Less Traveled altered the terms of public discourse about psychology and helped to shatter the taboo against religion that was once an integral part of psychoanalytic thinking. The center of the old psychology-religion debate has been shifting and continues to shift. Increasingly, grassroots therapists and popular writers on psychology are reintroducing religious ideas into therapy. The new literature on forgiveness is an interesting example. Such a term would have had no place in the Freudian nomenclature. Yet a number of psychologists now argue that healing of such wounds as child abuse is impossible so long as the victim is unwilling to forgive. Books on spiritually based psychological approaches are so numerous today as to constitute a major trend in the discipline. A glance today at the psychology section of any bookstore will reveal scores of titles alluding to spiritual themes: soul, spiritual growth, forgiveness, love. Moreover, an increasing number of psychologists and psychiatrists are beginning to acknowledge the data showing the strong positive link between religious commitment and mental health. While Freud dismissed religion as little more than a neurotic illusion, the emerging wisdom in psychology is that at least some varieties of religious experience are beneficial for mental health. The New York Times reported in 1991. The result is that growing numbers of psychologists are finding religion, if not their personal lives, at least in their data. And what was once at best an unfashionable topic in psychology has been born again as a respectable focus for scientific research. And side by side with these developments has come an institutional shift. Use of traditional psychoanalysis is declining, partly because of diminishing faith in its effectiveness, partly because of insurers have become less willing to pay for the lengthy treatment it entails. Meanwhile, one of the greatest sources of growth in the mental health industry has come in so-called congregation-based and Christian counseling, church-sponsored and religiously oriented counseling centers that explicitly mix techniques from secular psychotherapy with religious themes. New Life, one of the largest organizations offering religiously oriented therapy, now operates some 70 clinics in 50 cities across the country. The American Association of Christian Counselors, an organization of mostly evangelical Protestant therapists, grew from 751 members in 1991 to more than 14,000 in 1995. Some of the most enthusiastic advocates of spiritually oriented counseling, writes psychologist Lewis Andrews, are medical doctors and insurance officials who believe that religious faith helps many patients cope with life-threatening illnesses. In short, the mid-20th century concern that modern psychology would supplant religion has not been borne out. What we see instead, on a variety of fronts, is the emergence of a post-secular synthesis, a new way of thinking about mental life that blends modern therapeutic insights and techniques with a reaffirmation of the moral and spiritual dimensions of human life. The religious drive. Can modern psychology's late 20th century rediscovery of religion be taken in any way as evidence for the validity of the broadly religious worldview or for the existence of God? It is indirect evidence of a sort in the sense that the solution to the conundrum of mental health, stability, and happiness appears to lie beyond the reach of a purely materialistic or secular model of human consciousness. The effort to explain mental life or devise a model of mental health without reference to God was tried and failed. Of course, Freud implicitly defined mental health reasonably enough as a state of mind free from illusions, and one could argue that if religiously committed people report higher levels of psychological well-being, it is precisely because they have illusions. In essence, so the argument might run, religious believers are too naive to understand how miserable life really is. Interestingly, there's a growing body of research showing that certain kinds of illusions are in fact conducive to happiness, and also, what is perhaps more puzzling, to physical health and career success. In particular, the illusion of optimism seems to be an important ingredient of a happy, healthy, and successful life. As psychologist Martin Seligman has shown, an individual's explanatory style, the way he or she interprets the events that occur in life and his or her expectations about the future, can profoundly affect levels of psychological and physical well-being, as well as job and school performance. He has shown that pessimism, a pessimistic explanatory style, leads to greater levels of unhappiness and failure in life. Indeed, it can actually cause depression. Tests designed to measure individuals' levels of optimism and pessimism are reliable predictors of job performance. In one survey of sales agents, for example, the top 10% of the optimistic scale sold 88% more than the 10% who scored most pessimistic. Of course, one of the most profound and global sources of optimism is religious belief. One recalls evangelist Billy Graham's response when a U.S. senator asked him whether he was an optimist or a pessimist. "I'm an optimist," he answered. "I've read the last page of the Bible." Organized religion, Seligman writes, provides a belief that there is more good to life than meets the eye. Seligman sees clear psychological benefits in this sort of optimism, citing findings showing lower levels of depression among the religiously committed. He even speculates that the loss of religious belief in the 1960s was partly responsible for the dark mood and national disasters, from race riots to the Vietnam War to national disillusionment, of that era. Of course, the religious terms for optimism are faith and hope. It is more than a little ironic that after its long odyssey into the unconscious and its multiplication of dark modernistic concepts of mental life, modern psychology at the end of the 20th century should have arrived at a formula for mental well-being and happiness hardly distinguishable from that of traditional religion: faith, hope, love, self-discipline, and a life lived in conformity with solid traditional moral principles. And this is by no means to discount what modern psychology has learned, through research and clinical experience, about the effect of childhood memory or mechanisms such as denial or repression. It is not to denigrate the effectiveness of psychotherapy or even the use of psychotropic drugs to address mental ailments. It is certainly not to argue that the adoption of a religious worldview spells an instant end to one's psychological troubles, or to deny that obsessive and extreme religious views can be pathological, but it is to say that modern psychologists' outright rejection of God was an intellectual error even within the terms of the discipline, and that views of the nature of human consciousness derived from modern psychology and from religious revelation have tended to converge, rather diverge, over the past 20 years. In effect, at the end of the 20th century, modern psychology has found what we might call telltale signs of the soul. Indeed, the burden of the research would invite the speculation that the human mind is in some sense designed to require faith, that the religious drive or hunger is at least as powerful as any other, that the human mind does not find itself at rest until it acknowledges and develops a relationship with the Godhead. Of course, religious people would not find this notion surprising, even though for decades modern psychology tried to argue otherwise. Such a train of thought might also form beginnings or an explanation of the problem of evil. For if this world holds out many pleasures, it also delivers more than enough pain to compel the mind to seek its ultimate source of hope beyond this world. Those who confine their search for happiness to the glories and pleasures of the secular or material world, who live in the denial of the Godhead, will, as a practical matter, encounter much more mental tension, and as the research shows, will be far more likely to shipwreck on mental illness, drugs, or alcohol than will those who treat the present life as a spiritual journey, a teaching that, not coincidentally, virtually all the major religious traditions from Judaism and Christianity to Islam Buddhism and Hinduism share. Moreover, modern research tends to bear out the observation that sin breeds misery. It turns out that the Ten Commandments, or the basic moral law, as expressed by any of the major religions, are not just an arbitrary set of divinely ordained taboos or a path to a happy afterlife. They are also a very reliable guide to happiness and health in this world. As a child, one is forced, with a naivete similar to the biblical Adam's, to take this on faith. But one cannot reach a certain age without observing the enormous disruption and pain that serious breaches of the moral law cause, even in the life of the sinner. Adultery is a prominent example. Who has not known individuals who have ruined their lives almost beyond repair by yielding to a stupid temptation or placing the gratification of the moment ahead of their responsibilities to those whom they love? Yet even such failings and the sorrows that follow tend, in the logic of human mental life, to drive many such individuals back eventually to God. Countless are the cases where the descent to despair, via alcohol, drugs, sex addiction, or some other path, was the prelude to a recovery of faith. The founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill W., is a well-known example. From the depths of an alcoholic despair, praying for the first time in many years, he had by his own report a mystical experience that led him not only to stop drinking, but also to go on later to found AA. In effect, one could argue the world is designed to present the mind with a fundamental moral choice, as well as a dilemma, whose only solution lies in an acknowledgement of and encounter with God. But we are venturing into the terrain of the theologians. Even if we set aside the issue of what the structure of the human psyche may or may not imply about the existence of God, the findings of modern psychological research introduce an important change in the terms of the age-old debate between believers and atheists. In particular, it leads to a re-evaluation of Pascal's famous wager. Responding to the first generation of modern atheistic rationalists in the 17th century, the mathematician and philosopher Blaise Pascal offered an interesting thought experiment concerning religious belief. He conceived of the issue as a bet or wager. His reasoning was as follows. Revelation teaches that God rewards faithful believers with eternal happiness, and that those who reject God suffer eternal torment after death. There is no way for reason, Pascal conceded to his contemporaries, to know whether Revelation's claim is true, but we may consider our life as a wager, one that, in the nature of things, we can't avoid. If we bet against God, and Revelation proves to be true, we will suffer eternal torment. If we bet for God, and Revelation proves to have been an illusion, we lose nothing, for we shall cease to exist at death in any case. Of course, the touchy issue here concerns what those who opt for belief must sacrifice in this life. Revelation teaches that they must, in Pascal's words, curtail their passions. Pascal tried to minimize this sacrifice by pointing to the purely rational benefits of a life lived in conformity with the moral law. Now, what harm will you come by, he wrote, in making this choice? You will be faithful, honest, humble, grateful, generous, a sincere friend, truthful. And certainly you will not enjoy those pernicious delights, glory and luxury, but will you not experience others? The atheist and agnostic suspicion has always been that Pascal had soft-pedaled the sacrifice end of the bargain. In giving up the pleasures and glories that religion teaches us to forego, so the atheist argument has run, we are indeed sacrificing much. Nietzsche, in his anti-religious diatribes, made a particular point of emphasizing this, preaching the theoretical superiority of the life based on gratification of violent and erotic instincts, the nobility of the barbarian, a major reason that the Nazis found certain passages of his books so congenial. But modern research in psychology makes clear that the morally unrestrained life is not worth living. The crowning irony is this. Even if their beliefs were to be proved illusions, religiously committed people lead happier and healthier lives, as numerous studies show. But the larger point to recognize is that the modern secular psychological paradigm, the effort to give a complete account of the workings of the human mind without reference to God or spirit, has crumbled. Modernity failed to achieve its ambition of a comprehensive materialistic alternative to the religious understanding of the human condition. A purely secular view of human mental life has been shown to fail not just at the theoretical, but also at the practical level. The last thing Freud would have predicted as the outcome of more than a half-century's scientific psychological research and therapeutic experience was the rediscovery of the soul. Faith and the physicians. Alongside the findings from psychology, a growing body of evidence from medical research shows a strong positive link between religious commitment and physical health. At first glance, this should not be surprising given what medicine has learned in recent years about the connection between illness and stress. If religion is a stress reducer, and the data suggest overwhelmingly that it can be a powerful one, then we should expect religiously committed people, on average, to have lower rates of disease. One does not have to invoke divine intervention to explain this outcome. Certainly it is unnecessary to raise the suggestion, as a recent Time cover story on the subject did, that when it comes to health, the faithful actually have God on their side. Rather, the argument takes place on a different plane. Just as the anthropic principle reveals a physical universe seemingly designed expressly for human life, so what we have learned from psychology and medicine in recent years increasingly points to a mind and body designed for religious faith. The religious drive or hunger appears to be so profound as to have major measurable physiological consequences. Moreover, there is abundant empirical evidence for the beneficial health effects of certain religious states of consciousness, meditative or prayerful states of mind. In short, medicine, too, is on the verge of a post-secular revolution. It is rediscovering the soul. As Harvard Medical School Associate Professor of Medicine Herbert Benson puts it, contemporary medical research is showing that the human mind and body are wired for God. A healthy faith. The epidemiological evidence for the health benefits of religious belief and commitment, compiled by David B. Larson and his team at the National Institute for Healthcare Research, is impressive. Some examples. A major 1972 study examined death from various causes among adults in Washington County, Maryland, in relation to church attendance. Factors such as smoking, socioeconomic status, and water hardness were controlled for statistically. Findings were as follows. 1. Risk of arteriosclerotic heart disease for men who attended church frequently was just 60% of that for men who were infrequent church attenders. Among women, risk of dying from arteriosclerotic heart disease, pulmonary emphysema, and suicide was twice as high among infrequent as among frequent church attenders. 3, women who attended church infrequently were 4 times as likely as frequent church attenders to die from cirrhosis of the liver, a finding that may relate to the data showing much lower levels of alcohol abuse among the religiously committed. Blood pressure has been shown to be strongly correlated with religious commitment and church attendance. Religiously committed people and frequent church attenders have, on average, significantly lower blood pressure than do the religiously non-committed and those who attend church infrequently. The most startling finding concerned smokers. 1. Smokers who ranked religion as very important in their lives were over 7 times less likely to have abnormal diastolic pressure readings than were those who did not. 2. Smokers who attended church frequently were 4 times less likely to have abnormal diastolic pressure readings than were infrequent church attenders. A comprehensive 1987 review of nearly 250 epidemiological studies found positive associations between religious affiliation and physical health. A 1991 analysis of polling data from the National Opinion Research Center, which included questions on health and levels of religious commitment, found that levels of religious commitment as measured by self-reported frequency of church attendance and frequency of prayer correlated significantly with self-reported health status, regardless of the respondent's age. Wired for prayer. Some of the most interesting findings to emerge from this new post-secular research concern the benefits of prayer. Prayer, of course, had no place in the Freudian paradigm. It is by and large not something that takes place in the modern physician's consulting room. Medical doctors, like their counterparts in psychiatry and clinical psychology, are much more likely to identify themselves as atheists or agnostics than is the general population, though levels of unbelief among physicians treating the body do not match levels among those who purport to treat the soul. A 1991 survey of family practice physicians in Vermont, for example, found that only 64% of the doctors believed in God, in contrast to 91% of their patients. Yet opinion data show that prayer plays an important role in the lives of the vast majority of Americans. Various polls have indicated that over 90% of women and 85% of men pray. Over 3/4 of Americans pray at least once a week, and nearly 60% pray once a day. Paradoxically, even among the 13% of the population who describe themselves as atheists or agnostics, 1 in 5 reports praying daily. And in one Gallup survey sponsored by Life magazine, 95% responded yes to the question, have your prayers ever been answered? Religion versus magic. There is another far less conclusive strand of research on prayer and disease that has tried to measure the effects of so-called intercessory prayer. And this is a more daring enterprise, attempting to measure the effect of prayer not simply on the health of one who prays, but also on the health of others. In one 1969 triple-blind study, a prayer intervention group prayed for 10 children with leukemia. The children were not aware that they were being prayed for. Another 8 children served as a control group, for which the intervention group did not pray. A number of critics have raised ethical issues about such studies, with reason. After a 15-month period, 7 out of 10 children in the prayer group were alive. Only 2 of the 8 in the control group were alive. The point was to determine whether intercessory prayer could affect disease. However, critics point out that the sample was far too small to draw any conclusions. A 1965 study similarly compared results for a prayer group and control group of patients suffering from chronic stationary or progressively deteriorating psychological or rheumatic disease, and various clinical indicators were used to measure progress of the disease. No significant difference in outcome was detected between the two groups. The most widely publicized such double-blind study was undertaken by cardiologist Randolph Bird, himself a believing Christian, at San Francisco General Hospital in the 1980s. Bird's sample was sufficiently large, 393 coronary care patients. Of these, 192 were prayed for by prayer groups, comprising self-described born-again Catholics and Protestants of a devotional bent, whom Bird recruited for the purpose. The 201 patients in the control group were not prayed for. The difference in outcome for the two groups was significant. Neither patient group had knowledge of the experiment. The group prayed for had fewer cases of congestive heart failure and cardiopulmonary arrest, as well as fewer cases of pneumonia. They also used diuretics and antibiotics less. The findings seemed impressive at first glance. Wire services across the country headlined the story, but on careful examination, the study proved to be flawed because of too many uncontrolled factors and unknowns. First, the habits of the doctors treating the various patients were not controlled for. This raises questions about the findings regarding medication. Some physicians are quick to prescribe such medicines as antibiotics and diuretics, others slow to do so. Then there was the more fundamental problem of putting prayer itself in this fashion under the scientific microscope. Presumably, some of the patients in the control group had relatives and friends praying for them. Indeed, one would expect the majority of people in coronary care units to have people praying quite earnestly for them. Why should the prayers of the control group's relatives not have been heard, while the prayers of the strangers in Bird's recruited prayer groups were? Were the latter prayers better, even though they came from strangers who did not know the patients? How earnestly did the prayer groups pray, and for that matter, did they pray at all? Baird's was an ingeniously and carefully constructed study. But, as is clear, one sails quickly off the scientific deep end in this kind of research. Significantly, no one has yet been able to replicate Baird's findings. Other similar studies are in progress. And without prejudging the outcome of such research, one is inclined to raise questions about its underlying assumptions. First, while double-blind studies can capture a great deal, there are realities, and not just transcendent ones, beyond the reach of the scientific method. Second, the understanding of prayer underlying such studies seems overly mechanical. Indeed, it points to one of the real hazards of the post-secular revolution in medicine and the new discovery of spiritual healing. There's a kind of relentlessly utilitarian bent to the American mind that is prepared to reduce everything in life to a tool or a commodity. And spirituality is no exception. Think about it for a moment. Over the course of centuries, countless children have prayed earnestly over sick parents, and for that matter, parents over sick children, who, despite countless earnest prayers, have died. To date, none of us have escaped that particular earthly fate. Precious few of us escape illness over the course of a long life. Statistics show that religious people are, on average, physically and mentally healthier than their atheistic or agnostic counterparts, and that is well and good. Nevertheless, they do get sick and they do die. The notion that spiritual forces can be invoked at will to change the material conditions of our lives or those of others properly belongs not to religion or to genuine spirituality as it has been understood by mankind's greatest religious teachers, but rather to magic. It is not accidental that one of the most important phrases in Christian prayer is, "Thy will be done." The Hebrew Bible and the New Testament alike emphasize over and over again that true prayer and true spirituality lies in submitting the human to the divine will, and not the reverse. They also stress that the divine plan is not necessarily the human plan. "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord." Isaiah 55:8. Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism likewise agree in their emphasis on acceptance of the suffering that life metes out as one of the most fundamental ingredients of true spirituality, and one of the most important spiritual lessons to be learned in an earthly life. The prayerful and meditative states taught by the world's great religions and the world's great mystics are states of humble acceptance. It is worth remembering that religion, or true spirituality, does not promise exemption from suffering. On the contrary, it teaches the inevitability of suffering and even the necessity of suffering as a means of strengthening the soul and turning it from this world toward God. The prayerful or meditative states and outlooks that Benson finds so beneficial to health have precisely this character of acceptance. The great religions teach that one gains, here or hereafter, by sincerely giving up, by submitting to the divine will, for whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Matthew 16:25. Some New Age approaches to spirituality in particular part ways with religion and true spirituality in favor of magic. The various claims that certain spiritual practices can halt the aging process, extend one's lifespan by many decades, or for that matter, generate massive personal wealth, the well-grounded religious mind recognizes these as temptation in its classic form. They are not spirituality, but the parody of spirituality. They resemble one of those pernicious artificial chemical molecules that, mimicking a natural ingredient of the body, bonds with a living cell, weakening it, even rendering it cancerous. Magic consists of using the tools of the other world to achieve the goals of this one, rather than vice versa. That certain authors garner vast revenues by peddling such extravagant materialistic promises to the public in the name of spirituality should not be surprising, since the market for snake oil has always been bullish. But drinking snake oil usually does no good and often does harm. False promises such as these can be both a spiritual diversion and a hazard to one's health. Moreover, they encourage what psychologists call magical thinking. It is absurd to get to the stage where one views the catching of a common cold or a sore throat as the sign of a major spiritual failing, a syndrome that has been almost proverbially common in New Age circles, or where one believes one can control health symptoms at will. Of course, even our secular framework sometimes leads to this kind of thinking. Now that we know the link between colds and stress, we are sometimes inclined to seek out a psychological source for our sniffles. Colds, and for that matter stress, are a part of life, as is much more profound pain and suffering and normal maturity, to say nothing of spiritual growth. Intimations of Immortality. When Raymond Moody published his famous 1975 book on the near-death experience, Life After Life, it was greeted with a great deal of skepticism, not least in the medical and scientific communities. No one could deny that the story was deeply intriguing, drawing on interviews with 150 subjects who claimed to have had such experiences. The book compiled first-hand accounts of a world beyond death. Subjects who had suffered a heart attack or some other physical catastrophe described dying, floating outside of their bodies, and observing medical resuscitation procedures performed on them from a vantage point above the event. They described feelings of peace, well-being, and weightlessness, and the ability to travel instantly via thought. Many reported whooshing rapidly through a dark tunnel toward a point of light. At the end of this tunnel, they encountered a heavenly landscape and a being of light, whom many identified as Christ. Colors were unearthly and vivid. The light emanating from the being was said to be many times brighter than anything they had ever seen, yet it did not hurt one's eyes. Above all, the being was said to convey a powerful, unearthly, unconditional love. Some of the experiencers reported having seen and communicated with relatives who had died. A few described an extended encounter with the being of light, a conversation and a life review, a detailed replay of their entire lives in 3 dimensions, which consisted of all their thoughts and actions, as well as the effects of their thoughts and actions on others. And during this replay, the being helped them understand what they had done right and what they had done wrong. All of this seemed remarkable and utterly fantastic. It did not even conform that closely with the orthodox religious teachings about heaven, hell, and the afterlife. Who could believe it? One of the skeptics was Dr. Michael Sabom, then a first-year cardiologist at the University of Florida. Sabom stumbled on Moody's book somewhat by happenstance a year after it had been published. His wife and he had just joined a local Methodist church. A psychiatric social worker from the university gave a talk on Moody's book during an adult Sunday school class. Others in the class were enthusiastic about the discussion, but Sabom was annoyed and unimpressed. "The kindest thing I could find to say at the moment," he wrote later, "was, 'I don't believe it.'" Though a churchgoer, Sabom considered himself first and foremost a scientist. Early on in medical school, I strongly embraced the basic logic of the scientific method in relation to the diagnosis and treatment of disease. His concern was saving patients from death, not worrying about the afterlife. I suppose if someone had asked me what I thought of death, I would have said that with death, you're dead, and that's the end of it. Although I had been raised in a church-going family, I had always tried to keep religious and scientific doctrines separate. For me, at the time, Christian beliefs in life after death served the purpose of guiding proper worldly behavior and of relieving anxieties about death and dying, but such teachings remained subjective and unscientific. The psychiatric social worker pressed him to join her in a presentation about Moody's findings to a church-wide audience. He resisted at first, but later reluctantly agreed. The two of them would try an experiment. Before the talk, each would try to find at least one patient who had had a near-death experience. If there were such people, it should not be difficult for Sabam or his colleague to locate one. Sabam was working with heart patients. The social worker was stationed in a kidney dialysis unit, and both groups had frequent brushes with death. He began asking around. The third patient he inquired of, a middle-aged woman from Tampa, began describing the first near-death experience I had heard in my medical career. Sarah, the social worker, similarly found a patient who reported an NDE. They gave the talk, but Sabam remained skeptical and deeply dissatisfied with the unscientific, anecdotal nature of Moody's book. Most of the stories in Life After Life were recounted by people long after the events. No data were presented on the nature of the sample. Moreover, it was far from a random one. These people had come to Moody with their stories, sometimes following lectures he gave on NDEs. It was impossible to tell how many of Moody's 150 subjects had experienced the various aspects of the NDE, the tunnel, the being of light, the life review, and so forth. In addition, Moody provided no detail whatever on the individual's medical conditions or treatment at the time of the NDE. Sabam suspected that the individuals had fabricated the stories to please Moody, or that Moody himself had embellished the tales to help sell his book. Sabam decided to undertake his own more scientific study. As a cardiologist with access to the intensive care units of 2 hospitals, he was in an excellent position to do so. His study was to be more carefully structured than Moody's. He developed an approach and a neutral line of questioning designed to elicit such experiences without prejudicing the account. He taped interviews with patients and carefully gathered data on their medical situations, including their hospital medical records. Above all, he wished to refute the claim that people could visually witness medical resuscitation procedures from a vantage point outside their bodies. Sabam had participated in well over 100 such resuscitations and knew that lay people would be unaware of various medical details of these procedures. If he encountered anyone who claimed to have had witnessed such procedures out of body, he intended to probe meticulously for details that would not ordinarily be known to non-medical personnel. As he later wrote, "In essence, I would pit my experience as a trained cardiologist against the professed visual recollections of lay individuals. In so doing, I was convinced that obvious inconsistencies would appear, which would reduce these purported visual observations to no more than an educated guess on the part of the patient." Sabam began his study in 2 Florida hospitals. In 1978, having completed his cardiology training, he moved to Atlanta to take a position as assistant professor at Emory University of Medicine and staff physician at the Atlanta Veterans Administration Hospital. Over a 5-year period, he interviewed and compiled data on 116 persons who had had a close brush with death. Of these, 71 reported one form or another of near-death experience. The elements that Moody had described to the NDE were accurately reflected in the tales of Sabam's 71 subjects. In 1980, psychologist Kenneth Ring published an extensive, scientifically structured study of 102 people who had close brushes. It also confirmed the patterns identified by Moody. So many subjects in Sabam's sample reported having what he called transcendental NDEs, a sense of the ineffability of the experience, travel through the tunnel, encounters with Christ, meetings with relatives who had died, 2 had life reviews, but also included in his sample were 32 patients who claimed to have drifted outside their bodies and observed resuscitation procedures from a vantage point above or beside the event. Sabam classed those as autoscopic experiences, that is, self-perceiving. True to his original aim, he carefully probed for details. He compared their accounts not only with his own knowledge of such procedures, but also with the patient's medical records. In 26 out of 32 cases, patients had only a general recollection of the procedure. Even so, their recollections corresponded well with accepted medical procedure. Still, in Sabam's judgment, these accounts were too vague to permit drawing any firm conclusions. Physiological explanations. Moreover, the effort to provide a purely physiological explanation for NDEs has run into another set of problems. based purely on neuroscience considerations. Researchers have been able to induce what appear to be certain fragmentary elements of an NDE-like experience, notably feelings of ecstasy, a sense of another's presence, and an out-of-body-like experience through chemical or electronic stimulation. But there are theoretical problems with physiologically accounting for the near-death experience as a whole. The major difficulty lies in the contrast between the clarity and detail of the experiences as typically reported, and the presumably debilitated condition of the brain when they occur. Let's look at some major alternative explanations. Anoxia. This is one of the most popular hypotheses, an oxygen starvation of the brain. People who experience anoxia either in real life or in laboratories suffer distorted mental processes, deep confusion followed by a rapid descent into unconscious. Hallucination. One of the earliest hypotheses offered for the NDE was that it was just a hallucination, possibly drug-induced, or a dream. Not only do many people encounter NDEs with no drug involvement, but also, as a number of researchers have argued, the experience does not have the normal characteristics of a hallucination. Birth tunnel memory. The late Carl Sagan, an outspoken agnostic, theorized that the tunnel perceived by many near-death experiences was a memory of birth, a theory that gained adherence until it was pointed out that the eyesight of babies is too poor to perceive the birth canal. Endorphins. Given the lack of pain that NDE experiences report during the period out of body, other researchers have theorized that NDE could be the product of a massive release of endorphins, morphine-like natural painkillers. However, as Fenwick explains, neither artificial nor natural opiates have been shown to induce the NDE state. Hypercarbia. Another hypothesis has attributed the experience to elevated levels of carbon dioxide in the brain. In the 1950s, the American psychiatrist L.J. Meduna experimented with mixtures of oxygen and carbon dioxide administered to patients as psychiatric therapy. Patients recorded a variety of sensory imagery in response to the treatments, some of which strongly resembled the imagery of the NDE. I felt as though I was looking down at myself. And then I felt a wonderful feeling as if I was out of space. Given the NDE-like experience of some patients, would hypercarbia be a good candidate for explaining the NDE? It seems unlikely, since hospitals would be remiss if they permitted elevated blood carbon dioxide levels in, for example, temporal lobe involvement. A possible role for the right temporal lobe of the brain in the NDE was a possibility, is a potential option. Many features of the NDE experience would correlate with what is known about the right temporal lobe. It is thought to be the seat of emotion, to provide the sense of existential certainty of experience. But such transient perceptions hardly add up to a persuasive model for the entire NDE, which can include language, body image, narrative line, and even smells, factors that are known to involve other parts of the brain. Reason and spirit. Such is the great surprise as the 20th century turns into the 21st. The very logic of human inquiry is compelling a rediscovery of the realm of spirit, of God and the soul. And this process is both a positive and a negative thrust. In the first place, we see the mounting evidence for the existence of a spiritual dimension of reality. Along with this new evidence has come a growing recognition of the severe limitations of science and reason as tools for understanding the ultimate truths. The recognition has been central to the experience of 20th century philosophy, politics, and science itself. A generation and more ago, secular thinkers were filled with faith in reason and convinced that the scientific worldview was destined to replace the religious one. Modern thinkers predicted the disenchantment of the world, the disappearance of God from the human horizon. What our century has experienced instead is a disenchantment with reason, the collapse of the Enlightenment's secular and rational faith. We indeed find ourselves in a strange cultural moment, suspended between the twilight of the old paradigm and the birth of a new one. Nowhere is this paradoxical state of affairs more apparent than in the small but academically influential world of postmodern philosophy. At the core of contemporary philosophy is a strange contradiction. Contemporary philosophers have inherited the legacy of the modern death of God thinkers. Following Nietzsche and Heidegger, they argue that reason can discover no universal values, that rational analysis shows all moral views to be radically contingent, that all our highest impulses and moral yearnings are nothing more than the products of biology and accidental historical circumstances, that reason itself in the universal sense of that term does not exist. Yet postmodern philosophers find themselves repelled by the moral vision that originally accompanied the modern death of God insight. Nietzsche, declaring God dead and dubbing himself the Antichrist, openly preached the nobility of barbarism and cruelty. His radically relativistic and indeed deeply nasty philosophy helped prepare the soil of German culture for the rise of the Nazi regime. Nietzsche's great philosophical successor, Martin Heidegger, actually became an enthusiastic Nazi, implementing the Nazi agenda at the University of Freiburg, where he was rector in 1933 to 1934, and refusing to condemn National Socialism categorically even after the war. Contemporary philosophers are understandably appalled by this, and so contemporary philosophy has become an attempt to square the circle. It tries to set forth a humane moral vision while strenuously arguing, in the manner of Nietzsche and Heidegger, that such a moral vision has absolutely no rational or other foundation. Richard Rorty, the leading American postmodern philosopher, is a case in point. While he condemns Auschwitz, he argues that there is no rational or other basis to do so. Moreover, he claims we all would be better off, like him, if we recognized no absolutes, as he writes in Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity. At times like that of Auschwitz, when history is in an upheaval and traditional institutions and patterns of behavior are collapsing, we want something which stands beyond history and institutions. I have been urging in this book that we try not to want something which stands beyond history and institutions. The fundamental premise of this book is that a belief can still regulate action, can still be thought worth dying for, among people who are quite aware that this belief is caused by nothing deeper than contingent historical circumstances. Despite this relativistic perspective, Rorty spends much of his book trying to set forward a humane moral vision based on Judith Shklar's definition of liberals as people who think that cruelty is the worst thing we can do. His purpose is to overcome Nietzsche's insinuation that the end of religion and metaphysics could mean the end of our attempts not to be cruel. He argues that we should try to extend our sense of we to people whom we have previously thought of as they. He calls for human beings to deepen their empathy and compassion and extend their capacities to overlook tribal, cultural, religious, and other differences to move toward a more and more inclusive sense of we, a value he calls solidarity. There is, of course, nothing wrong with this vision, apart from the issue of whether we have a core self, to which I will return in a moment. On the contrary, it is admirable. What is peculiar is the claim that he can find no foundation for it. He ascribes almost as an afterthought to liberal self-doubt. But what could liberal self-doubt be if not a euphemism for conscience?
Two sides of the Enlightenment. It is often said that modern ideas of tolerance originated with the Enlightenment, the rebirth of reason in Western thinking. There is truth in this, but it is half-truth. The Enlightenment had two distinct sides, a light and a very dark one. In some sense, the history of the 20th century has been the dramatic confrontation between the Enlightenment's two faces. To credit the Enlightenment with all that is enlightened about the modern outlook is no more accurate than to credit the historical Christian religion with all that was good or humane in history. To quote Gandhi, much of what passes as Christianity is a negation of the Sermon on the Mount. As best as we can tell, the very early church, the pre-imperial church, embodied the New Testament values to a remarkable degree. Christianity gained converts in the ancient world with extraordinary rapidity. If we are to credit the early church texts, and Luke, the author of the Acts of the Apostles, strikes the reader as a level-headed, reliable narrator, part of the reason for this rapid growth was the miracles or signs and wonders that marked early Christian life, miraculous healings, visions, and so forth. This moment in history seems to have been marked by an unusual interpenetration of the human with the divine. But part of the reason for Christianity's rapid spread, historians have remarked, was simply that the early Christians were such nice people. The very kindness of the Christians and their service to the poor and downtrodden attracted new adherents. Christians astounded the ancients with their charity, as one historian has put it. Christianity spread partially by proselytization and partially by pure example. To put it in today's jargon, the early Christians walked their talk. But the bigger Christianity became, the more bureaucratic it grew. The Edict of Milan, which made Christianity the official religion of the empire, was a great boon for the church and a historical guarantee that Christianity would shape the West. But, as has often been observed, it also led to a politicization of the church, a partial re-submersion, as it were, of spirituality and culture. Gandhi, a Hindu, who learned profoundly from Jesus, but who had many bad experiences with Christians, wrote in the 1930s, when Britain still ruled India, that when Christianity had the backing of a Roman emperor, it became an imperialist faith as it remains to this day. One could hardly quarrel with him. By the Middle Ages, the Church was hardly distinguishable from any other political entity. The Pope ruled the Papal States, vied in secular power struggles, and even rallied Christians to war, including, of course, the Crusades, in which Christians slaughtered Muslims as a way of witnessing to their faith. Can anyone imagine Jesus' displeasure at such behavior? The Inquisition burned witches and heretics and persecuted independent thinkers. The bloody persecution of Jews was a recurrent phenomenon. The great legacy of the Renaissance, Reformation, and Enlightenment was the destruction of the Church's political power and the freeing of the human intellect from politically driven religious restraint. Of course, leave it to human beings to turn liberation into a new round of tribalism, as the supposed reformers waged war on the unreformed, and vice versa. But I have said that the Enlightenment, or more generally the rebirth of reason in Western culture, had both a good and bad side. This is an important dimension of modern history that has often been overlooked, especially by contemporary admirers of Enlightenment thinking. As a historical matter, reason did not free human beings from dogmatism or tribalism or the worst cruelties, as we have witnessed firsthand well into our own century. The rationale or scientific faith of Marxist-Leninist ideology sanctioned cruelties of a type and on a scale hardly imagined by the Inquisition in its darkest hours. Some estimates place the number of victims of Soviet communism as high as 60 million, and the methods of torture employed by the Soviet regime marked a kind of progress in this cruel art. Moreover, scientific rationalism, ironically, became the basis of the most absurd form of dogma and dogmatism that history records, the scientific ideology of Marxism-Leninism. Similar things can be said, of course, of Nazism, which was less a form of atheism than a quasi-mystical anti-religion, or religion of evil, with its own dark symbolism and neo-pagan myth and ritual. In addition to his major project of exterminating Jews, along with gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, the mentally retarded, and other groups, Hitler sought to destroy the mainstream churches. Hundreds of priests and nuns were sent to concentration camps. The Hitler Youth were indoctrinated in blasphemy. At the 1934 Nuremberg Party rally, the Hitler Youth sang that they were children of Hitler, a blasphemous parody of children of God. No evil priest can prevent us from feeling that we are the children of Hitler. We follow not Christ, but Horst Wessel. Away from incense and holy water, the church can go hang for all we care. The swastika brings salvation on earth. Orphans in state-controlled orphanages. said a new grace before meals, and sang a Nazi version of the favorite German Christmas carol, Silent Night, in which Hitler took the place of God and baby Jesus. The regime even developed neo-pagan marriage and baptismal ceremonies, which were practiced by the SS and their families. The racist Aryan movement of the early 20th century had a large occult dimension, which Hitler may have had at least a glancing encounter with in his Vienna days. The interesting thing is that the good and bad sides of the Enlightenment legacy have tracked very closely, historically, with the absence or prevalence of atheism, or an anti-God point of view. This was apparent in the contrast between the first two great revolutions produced by Enlightenment thinking, the American and the French, and noticed at the time. There is a contemporary debate between evangelical Christians and secular historians about the role of religion in America's founding. By and large, evangelicals who argue that America's founding was dominantly religious in character vastly overstate their case. Much of the thinking behind the framing of the American regime was secular, or deistic in character, notably Jefferson's. The framers made ample use of the insights of modern philosophers, many of whom were atheists or at least non-believers, but at the same time the thinking behind America's founding was not anti-religious or anti-God in any dimension. Many, perhaps most, who migrated from Europe to America came wholly or partly for religious reasons, usually to avoid persecution, up to and including my Catholic Irish grandparents, who fled the partly religiously justified rigors of British rule in Ireland. America was from the start and remains a deeply religious country. More pertinent, the framers included both 18th century deists and pious believers. There was a consensus on restraining religion in politics. Indeed, religious persecution was one of the major problems that the American regime was designed to solve, but no desire to destroy religion. In fact, there was broad recognition of its necessity to society. The founding document of the regime, the Declaration of Independence, invoked the Creator as justification for human rights. Even if this word was written by Jefferson in a deistic spirit, it reflected what he understood to be the fundamentally religious orientation of his civilization. Early American society was steeped in religion. The Continental Congress repeatedly declared days of prayer and fasting throughout the Revolutionary War. Leaders such as George Washington and Benjamin Franklin had a strong belief in divine providence or guidance of human affairs. All this was in sharp contrast with the French Revolution, which, as Edmund Burke noticed at the time, was inspired by the purist atheism. That is perhaps one reason why the main memory of this event, to recall George Orwell's phrase, is of a pyramid of severed heads. The French Revolution, in contrast to the American one, led to political cruelty on a scale that Europe had not before seen. The Americans, for one thing, had a vastly simpler task, a new country and a mostly clean slate to draw on. But there's an interesting historical correlation between atheism on the one hand and moral and political catastrophe on the other hand that has extended on up into our own time. We sometimes forget that the 20th century saw the first large-scale, long-term human experiment with a state based entirely on atheistic principles, the Soviet Union, and the result on every front was unmitigated disaster. The post-secular moment. The very collapse of communism belongs to what I would call the present post-secular moment, for human spirituality played a unique and pivotal role in communism's defeat. This is rarely acknowledged. To be sure, secular historians would say that the greatest mistake of communism was to attempt to defy the laws of economics. But other laws, too, came into play. The most potent internal challenge to communism in the 1980s was Poland's religiously steeped Solidarity movement, which had the backing of the Polish Pope. Without Catholic solidarity and the Lutheran-inspired Revolution of Light in East Germany, it is unlikely that communism would have fallen or fallen peacefully. Moreover, as historians penetrate the circumstances of the communist collapse, it is becoming clear that the Soviet elite was itself in the throes of an atheistic crisis of faith. Having lived under an atheistic ideology, one that consisted of lies and that was based on a big lie, The Soviet system suffered a radical demoralization in every sense of that term. People, including the ruling elite, lost all sense of morality and all sense of hope. It is even clearer in retrospect that Mikhail Gorbachev's perception of the failures of his system was in large measure a moral perception, a perception that society had lost touch with morality at every level. His initial approach to reform focused on a moral problem, alcoholism. He described what he saw as the sources of his society's crisis in his January 1987 speech to the plenum of the Communist Party. Interest in the affairs of society slackened, manifestations of callousness and skepticism appeared, and the role of moral incentives to work declined. The stratum of people, some of them young people, whose ultimate goal in life was material well-being and gain by any means, grew wider. Their cynical stand was acquiring more and more aggressive forms, poisoning the mentality of those around them. Disregard for laws, report padding, bribe-taking, and encouragement of toadyism and adulation had a deleterious influence on the moral atmosphere in society. Real care for people, for the conditions of their life and work and for social well-being, were often replaced with political flirtation, the mass distribution of awards, titles, and prizes. An atmosphere of permissiveness was taking shape. Exactingness, discipline, and responsibility were declining. The crisis that Gorbachev saw, in short, was a moral and spiritual one. At first he tried to remoralize his society by returning to the ideological roots of Marxism, Leninism, to the inspiring figure of Lenin. Later, incongruously, the Soviet leader began to refer, on certain occasions, to God. Those who knew the Soviet Union from the inside, for example, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, recognized that the system's crisis was primarily a moral and spiritual one. Even Western social scientists had begun to notice curious symptoms of decline. For example, communist societies in Europe, alone among industrial countries, appeared to have increasing mortality rates, doubtless a product of wide-scale alcoholism and related problems that could be interpreted as symptoms of psychological demoralization, related in turn to a banishment of spirituality from life. Most experts that I know, and in my work in arms control, I have had the opportunity to participate in discussions with many of the most prominent of them, still regard the collapse of Soviet communism as fundamentally a mystery. I would suggest that part of this mystery may be explained by purely spiritual factors, an argument put forth forcefully in George Weigel's excellent book, The Final Revolution. We have seen the mischievous consequences of atheistically inspired social policy and social experimentation closer to home. The philosophical underpinnings of the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s were essentially atheistic and anti-religious, though based avowedly on science. As we have seen already, there is now a growing consensus in society, even among secular scholars, that this revolution has created vastly more harm than good, whether measured by an explosion in teenage pregnancies and out-of-wedlock births, a skyrocketing divorce rate, and often related problems of juvenile delinquency and teenage suicide, or the epidemic of sexually transmitted diseases. Most of this sexual experimentation originated in America's own brief death of God phase. When Time magazine, reflecting the prevailing secular turn of the era, emblazoned on its cover in 1966 the question, "Is God dead?" it was an ill omen for American society if ever there was one. An interesting and representative example of that era's thinking was the book Open Marriage, A New Lifestyle for Couples by anthropologists Nana and George O'Neill, which marshaled the latest social theories to preach the supposed benefits to a marriage if both partners agree to permit each other to engage in extramarital sex. The patriarchal marriage system of the Judeo-Christian tradition, based on an agrarian economy, is simply outmoded today, announced the authors in a book that was a national bestseller in 1972. 5 years later, Nina O'Neill essentially recanted, revealing that numerous couples whom the pair studied had, not surprisingly, perhaps, found the experiment in consensual adultery disastrous. Modern social science now knows why the O'Neills were wrong. It has the data to demonstrate the ill consequences of the sexual permissiveness preached by an earlier generation of social thinkers. But for social science to have discovered, 2,000 years after the birth of Christ, that divorce is a bad thing and religious faith is generally beneficial to people, does not bespeak a great advance in human understanding. A final sobering lesson of our country concerns the degree to which reason is ruled by preconceptions, not only in the social sciences, but even in the physical ones. Positivists of Bertrand Russell's day assumed that reason decisively freed the mind from dogmatism, since its method was piecemeal and cautious. It built up the truth gradually from particular observations and experiments. That was its decisive advantage over the religious outlook. The way in which science arrives at its beliefs is quite different, he wrote, from that of medieval theology. Science starts not from the large assumptions, but from particular facts discovered by observation or experiment. But research in the history and sociology of science has shown that this is far from being the case. As Thomas Kuhn demonstrated in his groundbreaking work on the structure of scientific revolutions, normal science, or the work of reason, is always guided by some larger insight or belief, what Kuhn called a paradigm. Confronted with anomalous evidence that fails to fit the reigning paradigm, scientists do not typically let go of their accustomed model. Rather, their impulse is invariably to deny the evidence or explain it away. The great advances of science occur through revolutions, in which proponents of a new paradigm struggle with the adherents of an old one. Einstein himself was on the defensive side of such a battle. Having discovered relativity, he could not accept the implications of quantum mechanics and proposed extremely clever counterexamples. The battle was only completely resolved by an experiment in the early 1980s, long after Einstein had died. Though reasoning, observation, and experiment lie at the heart of science, the greatest scientific progress often seems to come from intuitive leaps. Positivism, the confidence that reason alone could defeat dogmatism, has gone the way of the century's other atheistic doctrines, adding its weight to what Marx called the ash heap of history. Reason has proved an imperfect guide to the ultimate truths about the physical world, let alone the ultimate truths about the universe and human life. Reason and spirit. What I am suggesting, and what it seems to me history tends to corroborate, is this. The knowledge of spirit is prior to the knowledge of reason. Where reason follows spirit, the results are good. Where it rejects or parts ways with spirit, the results are invariably disastrous, whether one speaks of the political, societal, or personal spheres. Reason rediscovers and reconstructs in slow, cumbersome, linear, and partial fashion what spirit already knows. There's nothing morally or socially admirable about the post-Enlightenment world that does not go back to values that were given to humankind whole in a priori form in the New Testament. Jesus already knew what modern humanity has only painstakingly discovered after 2,000 years and has yet to fully learn. The great achievement of the Enlightenment was, through the use of reason and common sense, to construct political and social institutions that would make the kind of respect for dignity of the individual human being that Jesus taught us a political reality in much of the developed world. These political institutions went a long way toward helping human beings free themselves from a tribalism that the gospel already condemned. The reason we admire what we admire in the modern polity is precisely that the values Jesus put forward in the New Testament are the central human values, and God has imprinted them on our souls. This knowledge lies deeper and is larger than reason, and one of the human tasks is to recover it. But reason is strongest, as was true for so many of our forefathers, when it accepts divine guidance. Reason is not a source of value. It is not by itself a reliable guide to the right or the good. History shows it does not free the mind of dogmatism. It does not free the mind of prejudice. It does not free the mind of cruelty. It is a logical and calculative function of the brain that is tied to the slowness of our biology and the material world. What we all have upstairs is a slow CPU that cannot grasp the whole truth, which exists a priori in a spiritual realm, and which has been revealed to us at moments of extraordinary interpenetration of the divine with the human world. Using our slow CPU, we can occasionally capture pieces of the truth in fragmentary form. But left to its own, used in a spirit unrelated to spirit, this slow CPU will lead us straight to disaster, as experience shows. The great error of the Enlightenment, for which the worst horrors of modern history are themselves the evidence, was the idolatry of reason. The belief that reason could replace God. Marx was such an idolater. Freud was another. The latter spoke in the future of an illusion of our God logos, that is, reason. Is it any wonder that the communist experiment eventuated in disaster? Or that a later generation of scholars has concluded that Freud's views of religion and of 1,000 other aspects of human psychology were wrong-headed? Should we be surprised that godless communism resulted in unprecedented cruelties, or that godless psychiatry has come under increasing criticism in recent years for condoning self-evidently immoral behavior? But doesn't the suggestion that spirit is prior to reason threaten to drive us back into a state of primitive ignorance and superstition? Or worse, forward into a world of postmodern irrationality, where cultists might claim spiritual insights that lead them to mass suicides and other forms of madness? We saw that reason, in the end, afforded no protection against social madness. Human beings, we have found in this century, kill as readily in the service of a rational dogmatism as a religious one, and perhaps in the end, more readily. If reason in the final analysis offers no protection against evil, then are we helpless in the face of our ignorance? There is, in fact, a simple test of insights, one that Jesus offers in the New Testament, and that we tend to apply in practice anyway. You will know them by their fruits. Matthew 7:16. Such was Jesus' advice in dealing with the problem of false prophets, and it might be applied as easily to the prophets of the God of reason as to the prophets of any cult. We certainly could see the fruits of communism, the fruits of religious intolerance, in places like Northern Ireland or the Balkans are obvious enough. It is not a difficult thing for human beings to judge whether the consequences of a particular line of thinking or a particular approach to life are good or bad. But this presumes that our moral perception, our ability to distinguish good from evil, is prior to our rational understanding. It seems to me that such a conclusion is inescapable. Without an ability to distinguish right from wrong, life degenerates rapidly into a tale told by an idiot. All of us, of course, have the ability to distinguish right from wrong, but sometimes this moral sense is clouded over by what the biblical tradition calls sin. All of us have had this experience, and all of us have seen others in the grip of such confusion. People who are rationalizing bad decisions, immoral decisions, that we know will lead them and others in their lives only to pain and suffering. When others do this, it is painfully obvious, even if we can be slow to recognize such wrong-headedness in ourselves. There is a close and inescapable connection between wisdom and goodness. And only people who are capable of distinguishing between good and evil with clarity are capable of making sound decisions, or for that matter, constructing sound theories on subjects pertaining to politics, psychology, sociology, and other aspects of human moral life. The moral law is no secret to humanity. God is beyond our comprehension, but His commandments are not. nor is there great variance in these commandments among the world's great religions. Particular ritual practices and prohibitions vary, but there is little variance in the basic moral law as understood by Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, or anybody else. One of the more interesting developments in the realm of theology in recent years has been the growing body of work demonstrating the broad agreement among the various religious traditions on fundamental moral issues. In 1993, partly under the impetus of theologian Hans Küng, representatives of the world's religions gathered in Chicago for a parliament that produced in turn a declaration. The declaration set forth a series of obvious moral precepts, ranging from noting the evil of sexual immorality on up to the crimes of murder and genocide. This consensual document represented agreement among an extraordinarily large and varied number of religious perspectives. While each tradition would probably ask more of its adherents than the document contained, the moral vision set forth in this consensus statement was remarkably rich. Right and wrong are no secret to us until we begin to deny that they exist. If the history of this century offers any lesson, it is that goodness and a relationship to God, to the Absolute, by whatever name he is called, is not only the beginning of wisdom, but the only path by which it can be attained.